Prime Minister Justin Trudeau co-hosted a virtual gathering of a special United Nations summit today.
This is our chance to begin a conversation on how we can emerge from this truly global crisis as a stronger and more cohesive world, one that creates growth for everyone, addresses inequality, and cares for the most vulnerable. Canada is ready to do our part as we help bring the world together in the fight against COVID-19.
As we speak, Canada is competing with Norway and Ireland for one of two non-permanent seats opening on the UN Security Council next month. Is this the right time to be campaigning? Marc-André Blanchard is Canada's ambassador to the United Nations. He joins us from New York. Hi, Ambassador Blanchard. Good to see you again.
Well, thanks for having me. So glad to be here.
Ambassador, I want to ask you in a moment about the event today, but first, just generally about Canada's bid for a Security Council seat, and particularly a comment this afternoon from the Secretary General of the UN. He refused to weigh in on the question of whether China is in breach of basically international law by imposing national security laws on Hong Kong. And I'm wondering what your response would be to critics who say that just underscores exactly why this seat should not be a priority for the government. Why are we fighting so hard to sit on a body that won't even weigh in on the most egregious of human rights infringements, rather?
Well, I think the Secretary General referred to is actually spokesperson when he made that comment. But in any event, I think the Security Council is actually the table where all of the issues, all of the conflicts of the world are put on that table and around that table. And this is why it's so important to be around that table. This is a table where everyone wants to be. This is the most significant table of multilateralism, of all of the multilateral organizations. This is the epicenter of it. And all of the conflicts are put there. So when you're around that table, you're more relevant. And if you're more relevant, you have more influence in the world. And if you have more influence in the world, you have more opportunities for Canadians in Canada and abroad. And this is, there are two parts to why we want to be on the Security Council. We want to be on the Security Council because the voice of Canada is important at this time in our history of the world and with the situation we're facing. But also, it is also in the best interest of Canadians to be around that table.
I take your point. I guess what critics would argue is, okay, you're relevant around that table, but is that table relevant? If, for example, the leader will not, and I take your point, he referred it to his spokesperson, but he had ample opportunity in that moment to say what China has done is wrong, and he didn't. So that question, the question of relevancy is more to the I understand your point that Canada will be more relevant, but is the table you're at still as relevant?
Well, you have to understand that the role of the UN is to actually convene around the table. And then the UN is only as good as the member states that are sitting around that table. So it's going to be our role when we're going to be sitting around that table to actually make the statement that we want and put forward the policies that we want and that we care about and that Canadians care about and that actually wants the direction that the Canadians want to see the world going. It's also one of the other view is that we need to act in our self-own interest, but we also need to look at it when you sit around that table to look at the interest of the world as well. And we believe in multilateralism because we believe there are some issues that cannot be dealt with bilaterally or unilaterally. And you need to have these tables, as imperfect as they be. They could be sometimes. Like, let's talk about Syria, for example. Mm-hmm. Syria was a failure of the Security Council. But for Syria, you have other success stories. You have Sierra Leone, for example. You could go back as Korea as a good example of a success of the UN. Then you could have Côte d'Ivoire, that is a success of the UN. So you have plenty of. So yes, it's not perfect, but on the other hand, it's actually something that is needed in the world, particularly at this time. And I always say, the UN was not created to, as one of the past Secretary General, the UN was not created to bring, mankind to heaven. It was created to avoid hell. And it's a difficult thing. It's a diplomatic space and arena, but it's only as good as the member states are on the table. And for example, in the case of Syria, you add Russia and the U.S., that were actually fighting against each other to a certain extent. When you get in that sort of situation at the Security Council, when the two permanent members of the Security Council are involved, it makes it incredibly difficult. But there are many other issues where there's consensus around the Security Council, even when you don't agree on many things.
And that sort of multilateral effort where the pandemic is concerned has certainly been a message of yours, and it was a message of the Prime Minister's earlier today. And again, I would ask you, in this instance, what you say to critics who say that Canada's sort of language is different than the reality. And I'll tell you what I mean. There's $160 million that the federal government has pledged so far for the global effort to fight this pandemic. And they've said there's more coming. I've asked multiple times in multiple interviews, well, what is coming? What more is coming? And when will we know? And there are no answers provided. So what do you say to people who say, well, this is the image we're putting forth of ourselves. This is what we're trying to sell to win this seat. But it's not backed up by the facts.
Well, I think the Prime Minister, the first thing that the responsibilities of the Prime Minister in this pandemic crisis was first and foremost to actually look at the domestic situation, and that's what he did. And a lot of efforts went into actually making sure that Canadians would go through this crisis as good as well as we can, and that the economy would actually go as well as it can be. The issue now of what we did today. Imagine Canada and Jamaica and the Secretary General convened the world today for the first time. It was the first global discussion of the North and the South, the developed countries and the developing countries together from all regions of the world and around the table, actually discussing some very key issues. We're facing one of the worst economic crises that we've ever faced. And, you know, this is not the financial crisis of 2008 and 2009. We have to think out of the box. And this time, we know that inequalities are big issues in this crisis. And to recover from this crisis, we will not be safe as Canadians until all of the world is safe. And it's the same thing from an economic perspective. We need, and so that the discussion we had today was actually very unique, because usually you have, you know, the most developed countries discussing together about how they're going to solve the situation, a lot like we did in 2008, 2009. This time it will not work that way. We need to bring, you know, the countries of the South, the small island states. We need to bring countries from Africa to the discussion, and have to accept that in those discussions we won't agree all the time, but we need to bring all of the elephants in the room and at least discuss them in a very candid way and see where there are common grounds. And this is what Canada does best. We've always been good at this, historically speaking. And this is a role that the Prime Minister Trudeau excelled at. He was, you know, lauded by everyone today for having had this initiative. They said, you know, thank you, Prime Minister, because you're the only one that can do that convening so well and bridging all the entire world together in that way. Canada is a mid-sized power. Canada is not the largest power, but we're a mid-sized power. And at that mid-sized power, what we have our best is our convening power and our ability to bridge between the developed world, the developing world, between the Commonwealth, la Francophonie, between APEC and in the Atlantic partners. This is where we play best, and we get more impact for the world, and that's what is appreciated.
I understand, Ambassador, what you're laying out, and I understand the significance of the discussion. But the rhetoric that we hear from the government, and often as in the context of championing for this seat, is that Canada is a leader. And the message the Prime Minister was delivering today was that there will have to be cooperation. There will have to be a putting aside of not just our own interests, but thinking of others' interests. And what follows from that is probably more than $160 million. I take your point about paying attention to the needs here in Canada, but the criticism of this government often has been that what they say is not backed up always by their actions. And I'm asking, will that not be relevant here?
Let's not forget, Canada is probably the 8th largest funder, or the 9th largest. It varies between 8th and 9th largest funder of all of the funds and programs at the United Nations. So we make already a big contribution. We are a big development partner for the South, and we are a big partner, for example, in the World Health Organization. We're a big partner with UNICEF. We're a big partner with the World Food Program. We're a big partner in education. We're taking a lead we've taken a lead with the health of women and girls. So this is Canada is perceived throughout the world as being a leader and as being incredibly generous. And we have, what we're looking for is impact. And we need to do things differently. In this case of the pandemic, you know, what will be needed is actually that it's not that the money doesn't exist. It's actually that the money needs to be channeled in a proper way. You'll need partnerships that don't exist yet, that you'll need to think out of the box for the role of the IMF, the World Bank, the public money, but the private sector money. And that's what is needed, that actually partnerships be established that leverages each other differently to ensure that together we fight inequalities and that we get back to a sustained economy and a situation of growth.
Okay, I have to leave it there. I'm out of time. Thank you so much for your time, Ambassador. I appreciate it.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
With a bit of a shaky connection there at the end, that was Marc-André Blanchard, Canada's ambassador to the United Nations. Hi, I'm Vashi Capellos, host of Power in Politics. See more of our show by subscribing to the CBC News channel or click the link for another video.